Okay, the time has finally come. We get to talk about the storming of the Bastille. I know. I'm excited too. In fact, we're going to talk about much more than just the storming of the Bastille. In this video, we're going to look at the popular revolution, the actions of the Parisian crowd in shaping the revolution in the early months of the revolution itself, in the summer and fall of 1789. So, let's get going. For this lesson, you're going to need something to take notes with, and one primary source, an anonymously published pamphlet called The Heroines of Paris. We're going to talk about this a little bit at the very end of the video. So let's pick up where we left off in the last video. It's July 1789. The new National Assembly has just gotten approval from the King of France, and has just begun its work on starting to reshape the French state. And meanwhile, back in Paris... things were tense. And the main reason had to do with the big questions that were dominating public debate and the military presence in the city. First, the questions. Everyone in Paris had been following the news from Versailles. The defiance of the Third Estate, the creation of the National Assembly, the King's decision to ask the members of the first two estates to join the National Assembly. It was all very exciting and inspiring for Parisians, but two questions remained. First, will this revolution last, or will the monarchy suppress it? In other words, yes, the king allowed the National Assembly to exist for the time being, but will he go back on his approval and eventually suppress the institution? And second, what forces of disorder or chaos will this new revolution unleash? Will disobedience and defiance become pervasive and spill out in the halls of the National Assembly into the streets? Coupling these worries was the context of the military in Paris. Paris was protected by the French Guard, a company of soldiers comprised mainly of Parisians themselves. Think of it sort of as a professional militia in a way. In the summer of 1789, however, there had been signs of dissent within the French Guard. On June 24th, two companies of the Guard refused to participate in public order duties, and thus disobeyed a direct order from their commanders. On June 30th, 10 members of the Guard refused to follow orders to disperse a crowd, and when they were arrested and carted off to a local prison, a crowd of some 4,000 Parisians stopped the caravan and freed the prisoners by force. It seemed that the French Guard was becoming a less and less reliable force against the Parisian crowd, so the king decided that he needed to bring in foreign troops, mostly German mercenaries, to do the job of the French Guard and maintain order in the city. So by July 1st, some 20,000 royal troops were now stationed in the city, and a deployment that large was nothing if not noticeable to the Parisian populace. Members of the National Assembly were nervous about the troop increases in Paris. Was this the monarchy's first step in dissolving the National Assembly? Was he getting ready to drive the representatives out by force? On July 8th, Mirabeau motioned that the king remove the troops from Paris. The motion was accepted in the National Assembly and overwhelmingly supported, but the king refused. He claimed that the troops must remain for the safety of, quote, his people. Parisians responded in a different way. They started forming their own neighborhood militias to do the job for the troops. Citizens' militias took on the role of policing and even confronted foreign troops at times demanding to be left alone in their jobs. These militias would eventually form the first units of the National Guard. More on this later. Tensions grew worse on July 11th, when popular hero Jacques Necker was once again fired from his position as effective financial minister of France. The king hated Necker, so did the queen, and many at court. His reforming ideas were only tolerated when the crown thought that they had no other choice. Such was the reason that he was brought in after Brienne anyways. But in the months after he was brought in, matters had only deteriorated for the monarchy's point of view. Having lost the battle with the National Assembly, Louis XVI saw no need to keep Necker around anymore. News of Necker's sacking, however, reached Paris the day after, on Sunday, July 12th. And this news came at a really bad time. First, it was a Sunday, which meant that most of Paris was out and about and free, Sundays being the Sabbath, and most people didn't work on that day. Because of recent crop failures, remember the hailstorm from the summer before, and the timing of the harvest, bread prices also were reaching their midsummer peak on that day. The straw that seemingly broke the camel's back, the news of Necker's dismissal, infuriated Parisians. Angry Parisians shut down local theaters in mourning, congregated in public places like parks, and even began burning effigies of hated members of the ministry. At the Tuileries Garden in the center of Paris, a number of Parisians were together debating the news when German troops entered the park. Apparently, one of the Parisians threw rocks at the troops, telling them to go away, and that led the commander to give the order to clear the park. The troops then moved against the crowd, and in the ensuing scrum, one man was left dead. Parisians were outraged. Many marched to the edges of town and started burning down toll booths at the gates of the city, an act that was symbolic of their unwillingness to obey the government. But the action sparked a new fear in Parisians. Would the king respond? Would the thousands of royal troops stationed in the city come after the Parisians who acted out in the days following the conflict at the Tuileries? And that brings us to the fateful day of July 14th, 1789. On the morning of July 14th, a group of Parisians, fearing that German troops would come to arrest and prosecute those responsible for the demonstrations against the king and his ministry, decided that they must arm themselves in order to protect the city from the foreign soldiers. So that morning, 60,000 Parisians congregated at the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital that also functioned as a storehouse for military munitions. The commander of the Invalides, hearing that the crowd was on its way, ordered the members of the French Guard stationed there to dismantle the muskets stored in the hospital. In the hour or so that it took the crowd to reach the hospital, however, the obviously unmotivated soldiers dismantled a whopping 20 of the 32,000 muskets in their warehouse. The soldiers were obviously on the side of the crowd. And when the crowd arrived, they quickly broke into the Invalides and seized some 28,000 guns and 10 cannons. The French Guard refused to fire on the crowd, and a unit of the French Guard garrisoned nearby refused their order to provide backup. The crowd was now armed. The problem was that the Invalides stored weapons, but not ammunition. So the crowd still needed bullets and gunpowder, and for that they had to go across town to the Bastille, a prison and fort on the east side of the city. The Bastille, however, was also more than that. It was infamous for being the place where political dissidents, rabble-rousers, etc., were imprisoned at the whim of the monarchy. It was a symbol of arbitrary royal authority, the ability of the king to do whatever he wanted to anyone he wanted, no matter the consequences. And on July 14th, there were only 7 prisoners staying at the Bastille, and none of them were particularly high-profile political activists or dissidents. But nevertheless, at 10 a.m., the crowd reached the Bastille and joined with locals of the neighborhood, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. They sent in representatives to negotiate with the Bastille's commander-in-charge, Bernard René de Launay, and get him to fork over the munitions. Initially, the meeting between Launay and the representatives went well. Launay invited them to have breakfast with him and immediately agreed to their first request to remove the cannons from the top of the Bastille so that they were no longer pointing at the crowd below. But the amicable meeting backfired on them, for in pulling back the cannons, the soldiers appeared to be getting ready to load them. The crowd below saw the action and panicked, assuming that they were about to be fired upon. Many members of the crowd stormed into the outer courtyard of the Bastille, and they sent in 2 more representatives who this time demanded that the entire fortress be surrendered to the crowd, a demand that Launay categorically rejected. And that is when all hell broke loose. Some members of the crowd started breaking down the gate to the inner courtyard, and eventually shots were fired and fighting broke out between the troops on the roof and the crowd below. The crowds pulled a bunch of wagons into the outer courtyard and set them ablaze to give them a smoke screen and block the view of the soldiers above. Fighting continued until members of the French Guard showed up, with even more weapons, and these weapons were loaded. But instead of suppressing the crowd, they joined them and aimed the weapons at the fort and its garrison. Worried that the fighting would escalate, Launay finally surrendered and turned himself and his troops over to the crowd's representatives. They escorted him out of the Bastille and into the midst of the crowd below, and by this time, many had been injured by the fighting. The crowd wanted blood. One of the officers stationed at the Bastille, now under custody of the crowd, remarked that he and his fellow soldiers were, quote, met with threats and a clamor from the whole mob that we ought to be hanged. Swords, bayonets, and pistols were being continually pressed against me, he wrote. Stones were thrown at me, and women gnashed their teeth and brandished their fists at me. Launay eventually ended up kicking a man who was threatening him. This led to the crowd seizing him and striking him with fists and knives and even bullets, until finally he died in the streets. The crowd then cut off his head and placed it on the end of a pike and began parading it around the city as a message of revenge for those who had suffered during the conflict of the Bastille. 83 Parisians died in the fighting, another 73 were wounded. But Paris had captured the Bastille, and shortly thereafter began dismantling it, piece by piece. The National Assembly was divided on how to respond. Many noted the tragic nature of the conflict at the Bastille. Others used it as an opportunity to push the king for their originally desired removal of troops from Paris. Here was the result of so many foreign troops packed into the city, they argued. On July 15th, the king appeared before the National Assembly and formally ordered foreign troops removed from the city. 2 days later, he met with leaders of Paris and for the first time ever appointed a mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly. He also conferred the creation of the National Guard from the Parisian militia units and gave them charge of patrolling and protecting the city in the wake of the removal of the foreign troops. He placed the Marquis de Lafayette in charge of the new National Guard, and he approved of their official symbol, a cockade, or ribbons of white for the Bourbon monarchy, and blue and red, the colors of the city of Paris. And the tricolor was born. The storming of the Bastille was the quintessential popular action of the French Revolution. It's the one that everyone thinks of when you think of the... Wait. Oh. Okay, I'm getting word that we have to cut to Broadway fanatic Watkins. Broadway fanatic? Oh man, I love the French Revolution. It's a story of Les Mis, right? Like Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert and the student riots and the barricades and General Lamarck and Lamarck is dead and it's... What's that now? Wrong revolution? Oh, 19th century. 19th century. So, this is not the same. Oh, okay. Okay, well, thank you, Broadway fanatic Watkins. If you actually want the story of Les Mis in its proper historical context, you could take my other class, The History of Modern France. In reality, the Bastille was just the beginning. A few months later, another one of what historians would call the revolutionary journée, or the sort of events or days of the revolution, would take place. An important event in October 1789 called the March to Versailles. The next story of the popular revolution begins with the context, once again, of bread. Remember that bread was the staple crop for most 18th century French people. It supplied upwards of 75% of a French person's daily caloric intake. An average family consumed 8 pounds of bread each day, or 2 4-pound loaves, and the average price of a loaf was something in the order of 8 to 9 sous. An average male worker at the time made something like 20 to 30 sous each day in wages, so on a good day, laborers spent anywhere from 25 to 40% of their salary on bread. When bread prices went up, it was a big, big deal. And those people who were most in tune with the price of bread, and when its fluctuations were too high, were the women of Paris, the ones who did most of the shopping and food preparation in French families. And it just so happened that 1789 saw another terrible harvest. The country never really recovered from the freak hailstorm that devastated the summer crop of 1788. The winter of 1788 to 89, moreover, was unusually long and cold. Planting began much later in the year, which meant that the food supply was really thin. And remember that because of the demographic shifts in France, there wasn't much room to spare. By October 1789, flour was starting to run out, and bread prices started to spike. A 4-pound loaf in Paris was going for 12 sous, and some bakers were even pushing prices as high as 18 sous. Why is all this important? Well, at the same moment, something else was happening. The Flanders Regiment, the royal troops normally stationed in Flanders in the northeast of France, were ordered back from the front. In celebration of their return, the king and queen hosted a banquet in their honor in Versailles. Now, this was standard protocol. Whenever soldiers returned from the front, they were given this sort of reception. But this event sparked rumors. It was suggested that at this banquet, conversations turned decidedly anti-revolutionary. Drinks flowed and rowdy talk began about the state of France. There were loud oaths to the king and queen and against revolutionary leaders. Soldiers tore off their revolutionary cockades and put on royalist ones. Bands played songs dedicated to the monarchy. News of the event eventually reached Paris, where journalists, in particular, denounced it and argued that it was evidence that the king and queen should no longer be in Versailles, where there were too many, quote, bad influences. Moreover, there was concern about the lavish party held at the moment when France was running out of bread. If the royal family were in Paris, many supposed, then Parisians would not have to worry about the city being fully supplied with food. Well, all this boiled over on October 5th. Working women of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the same neighborhood that surrounded the Bastille, woke up to find exceedingly high bread prices in their local boulangeries. Instead of simply confronting the bakers, they made their way to the city hall, Hôtel de Ville, to demand action from the new municipal government. The men at the Hôtel de Ville, however, passed the buck. They said they couldn't control the price of bread. Only the National Assembly had the ability to do something like that. And so, the crowd of women decided that they would take their complaint all the way to the National Assembly in Versailles. By the time they left the city, the crowd was over 6,000 strong. Now, Versailles is some 19 kilometers from Paris. Nowadays, you can just hop on a Parisian commuter rail and be there in like 20 minutes. But in the 18th century, you had to walk, and it took a long time. The crowd, hungry and angry, having not eaten all day and walked 19 kilometers, finally reached Versailles and the National Assembly at 5:30 p.m. The assembly was in session when the women burst into the hall and demanded they hear their complaints. The president of the assembly interrupted and called for order in the session, to which one woman, who had just walked like 10 miles and hadn't had breakfast, lunch, or dinner, replied, "We don't give a about order. We want bread." I can relate. The members of the National Assembly, rightfully terrified, said they would immediately request a meeting with the king to see what could be done. On their way to the palace, the crowds followed and camped outside the royal chateau, awaiting news. Representatives from the National Assembly and 6 women from the crowd entered the chateau and met with the king in one of his chambers. After presenting their requests, the king, allegedly, replied to a Parisian flower seller with the following words. He said to her, "You know my heart. I will order all the bread in Versailles to be collected and given to you." A touching statement, albeit less than believable. But by this time, the crowd outside was getting pretty rowdy. They started chanting, "Bread, bread, bread." And some even started chanting more aggressive things too, threatening the king and queen if they didn't give them what they wanted. Meanwhile, back in Paris, members of the National Guard heard news of the march and the actions of the Parisian women and demanded that they march to Versailles in support. Lafayette originally tried to talk them out of the idea, but when members of his own unit threatened to hang him from the lamppost, he eventually complied. So Lafayette and 20,000 members of the National Guard began to march to Versailles. They arrived at the palace at 11 p.m. Lafayette immediately entered the palace and began talking to the king about concessions he could make to calm the crowd. By 2 a.m., it seemed that the crowd was fairly settled. But shortly thereafter, in the middle of the night, some women and men from the crowd managed to break into the palace. The guards eventually found them and fired on them, killing a young journeyman artisan. The gunfire woke up many of the crowd who had fallen asleep camped outside of the palace, and the group inside was incensed, and they charged the guards, eventually capturing one of them and decapitating one of them. More broke into the palace, and soon there was a mob going through the entire chateau. The crowd was angry, and they started screaming for the king and queen, repeating many of the incredibly derogatory slanders and slogans that had featured prominently in the libelle of the pre-revolutionary and early revolutionary eras. "Death to the Austrian," they shouted, and called the queens all sorts of names. The king and queen scrambled to get to safety. Lafayette finally found them and convinced them that they had to address the crowd for their own safety. So, early in the morning, the two appeared, along with their children, on a balcony facing a bulk of the crowd. The people started chanting, "The king to Paris! The king to Paris!" And the king replied, "Yes, my friends, I will go to Paris with my wife and with my children." and the crowd roared and cheered. Soon thereafter, the king's attendants packed the royal carriages, and the royal family got in and started to make their way to Paris. The crowd escorted them the entire way, singing songs, mocking the king and queen, and celebrating their victory. They boasted to all who saw them on the way back, quote, "We've brought the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." The March to Versailles was important for a number of reasons. First, it was a reminder of the power of the crowd and the way that the Parisian crowd could direct the course of the revolution. Second, and perhaps most importantly, the March to Versailles shifted political power from Versailles to Paris. The royal family moved to Paris in October 1789, and they would never return to Versailles. The National Assembly followed them shortly thereafter and moved their activities to Paris as well. Because of the March to Versailles, all political power and all political activities seemed to be moved to the city of Paris. Paris became the center of the revolution. Third, the storming of the Bastille and the March to Versailles produced a sort of divide between the popular revolution and the official revolution. From very early on, within the first months of the revolution, we see that there were tensions that emerged between the people that were actively engaging in the official revolution in the halls of the National Assembly and those in the streets who were directing the revolution at the popular level. And now I want you to take a second and read the primary source that I've assigned to you for this video, The Heroines of Paris. This was an anonymously published pamphlet that came out shortly after the March to Versailles in October 1789. And in it, you'll see that the anonymous author lauded the women of Paris for the March to Versailles and for the actions that they undertook. They saw, or the author saw the women as being heroes of the revolution and of France. But this popular revolutionary activity was also a double-edged sword. And you'll see what I mean when you read the document. Women played a central role in the popular revolution. Largely barred from any participation in the official revolution, there were, for example, no female delegates to the National Assembly. They could only make their impact on the course of the revolution through popular action. And they did so in important ways, as we've already seen. We'll discover more about this in class, but the document that you just read illustrates how many recognize the integral role they played in directing the course of the revolution. But I also want you to pay attention to the end of the document. At the end, you can see a bit of the double-edged sword that I was talking about. For while promoting the actions of the women in October 1789, the journalist who wrote the pamphlet quickly turned around and suggested that women should stop acting in that way and turn their attention to other things. And here's what he wrote. I repeat, those who have just saved us deserve our full gratitude, and as the beginning of repayment, we must give them some advice from which they will undoubtedly profit. They must not embark upon any more expeditions which could degrade them. They must sustain the glory they have acquired. They must show themselves worthy of the beautiful role they have just played out before all of France. They should take upon themselves a respectable self-discipline, and one which would do them infinite honor. That would include never drinking in excess, a horrible thing in women because they must always be the very incarnation of softness and modesty, but also not allowing drunkenness in men. And the author went on. If you ever wondered if there was such thing as mansplaining in 18th century France, well, now you have your answer. Later on, of course, the author suggests that there are important roles that women should continue to play to surveil and protect the city. But notice that he's really trying to make sure that women no longer participate in the type of unpredictable politics that had won them such acclaim just weeks before. This view is indicative of many of the members of the official revolution who looked at the popular revolution with some trepidation. This trepidation, however, was most visible when they focused on the political actions of women. The popular revolution both gave women an avenue for impacting the revolution, and it gave some men an argument for trying to restrict women's access to revolutionary power later on. Okay, that's it for this video. Don't forget to bring your notes to class. Good job, good luck. See you soon.